How's it going, guys? Zachary here, and today I'm going to share with you some interesting information about a new version of the Omicron variant of COVID that seems to be able to bypass the standard PCR test that is used to not only detect the COVID infection itself, but the different types and variants of COVID that one could be infected with. But to begin, you'll need a little bit of background on the PCR test itself and how it functions. So PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction. Now, polymerase, although it sounds like a very complicated idea or word, it really is just the name of a protein that living organisms use to replicate their genetic code. And so what this does is it's a series of steps that use polymerase to replicate some genetic code, whether it's DNA or RNA, over and over and over again. And so the way that this is accomplished is that the people running the test will take what are known as primers, which are segments of matching genetic code that sandwich the gene you're trying to amplify through this replication over and over and over again. So as long as you know the start and end code of the gene, you can replicate the whole gene with no problem. And so basically the steps are you take the sample of genetic code and you heat it up to the point of where it separates its bindings and becomes single-stranded. Then the primers are attached to the genetic code so that way the polymerase can then read and replicate it. Once that happens, then that cycle is repeated over and over and over again to produce many copies of that gene, at which point annealing takes place where the single strands are put back into double strands for DNA, for instance. And then you have your final product. So why is this important? So basically, the PCR test for COVID looked for 3 specific genes, of which the Alpha and Omicron variant test positive for 2, because they have a deletion in their genetic code that translates into a spike protein. And so the genetic code is basically made up of these bases or base pairs for DNA. And each base is set up into groups of 3 that then code for individual amino acids that make up the proteins. And so when you remove one of these bases, it can shift the entire gene down, creating new sets of 3. And that's what's known as a frame shift mutation. And so Omicron and Alpha have a deletion in that protein where 6 bases are missing. And so that means that basically 2 amino acids will be missing from that spike protein. The problem is that this stealth variant does not have that deletion, which means that when they're looking for this deletion to detect Omicron, since this doesn't have that deletion, it's harder to detect because it will look like something else. And now the reason that one can detect Omicron over Alpha, even though they both have this deletion, is primarily due to Alpha being a lot less prevalent in the world with infections as Omicron and other variants are, since especially things like Delta took over very quickly. So what does all of this mean? So in my opinion, based on the significant genetic differences between the stealth Omicron and the regular Omicron, and including the lack of the deletion in the stealth version, I believe that this Omicron has evolved separately on its own from the original Omicron and is not necessarily a offshoot of the original Omicron, especially since once bases are removed, it's very hard to put them back in the very same order that they came from. And so with this, it's possible that this Omicron will function differently than the original. However, just because there are genetic differences doesn't guarantee that there are functional differences, as you can have mutations that are different sets of 3 or codons that actually code for the same amino acid. So sometimes mutations don't actually have any real impact on the functionality of the organism. Now, it is something to keep an eye on and to look forward with, but I don't think that it will necessarily cause any more issues than the original Omicron itself. And so to conclude this video, the stealth variant of Omicron really only gets around one specific test. We are still able to determine with other genetic testing that it is a different variant than Omicron or other versions of COVID. And we can still, even with the PCR test, determine that it is COVID at all. And so, and my thoughts are that it really isn't going to be a huge issue unless there's something that changes or something else is discovered that really rocks the boat. Something to keep an eye on, but at this point, it's nothing that I would really worry too much about. That being said, I still recommend that people get vaccinated and take safety precautions to avoid catching and spreading the disease, to avoid new variants from coming up that may be more dangerous. So if you like this perspective and found it useful, feel free to share it with someone else who might find value with it. And don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.